before we talk about the ways we can use get diff, the different variations, the options, let's discuss the output. So the output that we get from get diff, whatever the diff is that we're trying to generate, it always follows a very similar pattern. And it looks something like this. You can see over here on the right, it's kind of crazy looking. I mean, we see, hopefully relatively clearly, some of the code or changes in a file, but then there's a bunch of stuff before. We've got pluses, we also have minuses, we have weird looking symbols, these ats. So let's walk through what exactly is going on. So for these diagrams, I'm using a very simple example of a repository where we have a file called rainbow.txt. And I made a commit. It looked like this: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. That's how I learned the rainbow when I was a little kid. It was just blue and purple at the end. But then we make some new changes. We haven't committed anything, but I made some changes in the working directory in the same file, and I updated it to be blue, indigo, violet, Roy G. Biv. Okay, so clearly we can see it's a minor difference. We changed this same file so that purple is gone. We deleted that, and we added indigo and violet. So when I run the get diff command, and again, I'll walk through doing that in the different variations, but I'll get an output that looks something like this. So there's a lot of stuff going on, even just for that tiny little bit of a change. Hopefully you can see, right? We see purple in red with a minus sign, indigo and violet in green with a plus sign. But let's talk about what we actually see on this diff, on this output. So the first thing up top, it's going to say diff and then -- get, but then it's going to have the files that are being compared. Usually these are actually going to be the same file, just two versions, the old version of Rainbow and the new version, right? The version from the last commit and the version in my working directory. But it could be different files. You would have to set that up yourself. Typically it's the same file just over time. Between commits, between branches, between your staging area and your working directory, it's the same file typically. So get is going to call one A and the other one B. So you can see rainbow.txt, the first one here, is going to be A. Rainbow.txt, the second one, will be B. So we may get an output that's a lot more complicated, but there's always going to be the first line, the files that are being compared, two files. So helpers.scss compared to helpers.scss, and here's what changed in that file. And here's another file, main.css, main.css. So if I just rerun the command that I had earlier, we can see it's telling me here is the diff between index.html and index.html. And then I keep going down. Now we have a different file, grid.js and grid.js. If I keep going down, here's another file, main.css, main.css. Okay, so it's just telling us the two files. Usually they're the same file over time. Then the next line does not matter for the most part. I've never needed to ever take a look or understand it. It's metadata about the files that are being compared. Each file actually gets its own hash. That's what we're seeing here, but really it doesn't matter. And then this is an internal file mode identifier. Again, not important. Then we see two lines of markers. This is Git's way of telling us that for file A, whatever that is, it's going to be indicated, changes in file A will be indicated with a minus sign, and file B will be a plus sign. So that part's hopefully straightforward. Then we get to chunks. So you might have a file that's 10,000 lines long, you changed one line. Get diff is not going to show you the entire 10,000 lines. It's going to show you the change, that part that was changed, and then a little bit of context before and after. So we can see, here's what was changed, and then there's some context before, and it's at the end of the file, so there's nothing after. Here, I changed this line here, so we get a little bit of context before, and then some after. And then here's another change. We got context before and after. So this file itself might have been a couple hundred lines, I think it is, but it's only showing us a small selection, a small chunk around each change. So each chunk starts with a chunk header, which looks like, here's just multiple chunks, by the way. This is one file, main.css. It has one chunk and then a second chunk, just two different areas in the file that were changed. So a chunk header is the header at the beginning of each chunk, and you can identify them by the two @ signs on either side, and then some weird looking numbers inside. All right, so there are two pairs of numbers. one set of these numbers corresponds to file A, the other file B. That's what the minus sign here indicates. So minus, as we see, is for file A, plus is for file B. Anyway, what these numbers are telling us is how many lines have been extracted in this chunk. So how big is this chunk from file A, and what part of the file do they start from? So it's kind of confusing. I personally don't spend a lot of time looking at this. I'm usually looking at the changes, but just so you understand how to read it, this first bit says from file A, because the minus sign, 4 lines have been extracted starting from line 3. So this is not -3, it's just 3. The minus indicates A. So 4 lines starting from line 3. And so the next part from file B, we have 5 lines starting from line 3. So I'm going to diagram that out here. This is what our files looked like. This is file A, this is file B. Old version from the last commit, new version, same file, but just what's changed. Well, the chunk says from file A, we get 4 lines starting from line 3. So 1, 2, 3, this is line 3. We get 4 lines, yellow, green, blue, purple. Then file B is going to include 5 lines starting from line 3. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, one thing that is kind of confusing is that it shows orange right here. This is line 2 of our file. Technically, this is not really part of the chunk itself. Depending on the language of your file, if it's Python or JavaScript or something else, sometimes it will display a little preview of a line. Other times, this is something else. It's not reliably a line from the chunk. It's confusing. So it starts here. Anyway. So what we have here are the 2 ranges, right? Those numbers, 3, 4, 3, 5. And then down below, we have the actual changes. So this is the content of the file, 2 files superimposed, where we can see every line that starts with a minus. It was a change that came from file A. And every line that starts with a plus comes from file B. So these lines, yellow, green, blue, are unchanged, right? They exist in both. But then purple, which is actually red, but purple has that minus sign, came from file A, and it's not in file B. And then indigo and violet came from file B, they're not in file A. Usually Git picks A and B for us in such a way that you can think of file A as like the old stuff and file B as the new stuff, but it doesn't always work out that way. So this tells us, as we already know, that yellow, green, and blue are in both files. Nothing changed there, right? Red, orange are both in there too. They're just not part of this chunk because it just picks a small little bit of context around a change, and the change happened right there. Purple turned to indigo and violet. So indigo and violet are new, purple gone. So here's a more complicated example. This is for a style sheet, main.css. We can see up top, same file, just compared A and B. Then we see the chunk header, and then here's our chunk, some context, and we see that we ended up with 4 new lines in this chunk added as part of file B. And then here, the second chunk in the same file, it just skips down. We're starting at line 63 now instead of 22. There's a whole bunch of stuff in between that just doesn't show up. We see that file A had these lines in red that are gone, and file B has these, 6 lines that are new. So that's a basic concept for how these diffs, these outputs work. If we just go back here, I know it's kind of crazy to look at, but hopefully you can step through and understand what each line does. So this is telling us we're comparing 2 files, same name, just at different points in time. What those points in time are, we can set up ourselves. We'll learn how to do that in the next couple of videos. And then we see this stuff, the metadata we really don't need to care about. Then we see each version, A and B, are both assigned a symbol. A gets minus, B gets plus. Then we have the chunk header. It tells us 7 lines from line 25 are coming from file A, and 7 lines starting at line 25 are coming from file B. Then what we see here are those 7 lines from file A, right? 1, 2, 3. This one came from A, so 4, 5, 6, 7. And the 7 lines from file B, 1, 2, 3. Skip that one, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then, of course, the color coding is helpful, but this minus sign means it's a file A line that only exists in file A. This means it only exists in file B. Usually this means old versus new. And then we've got a second chunk in the same file where there's just a line that I added, chickens, that only exists in file B. Nothing was removed or changed in file A at this point. And then we've got other files, right? The same sort of idea applies to this different file or to this JavaScript file. There are different chunks excerpted, I don't know how you say that, different excerpts from the files. All right, so in the next video, we'll talk about different ways that we can use git diff to make different comparisons, where we will see very similar looking outputs that follow the same pattern.